Denzel Washington walked onto the Late Show set that Tuesday night with the kind of presence that didn't need applause to feel powerful. He gave a half smile as the audience stood for him, calm and deliberate, moving like someone who had nothing to prove. He sat down across from Stephen Colbert, clasped his hands loosely in his lap, and nodded when Stephen said, "You know, we don't get many legends in this chair, Denzel. Thank you for making the time." Denzel said, "I'm glad to be here, Stephen. It's good to talk when the world feels like it's on fire." The first 20 minutes were light. They talked about his new film, a quiet, emotionally complex role about a man coming to terms with his past. Denzel spoke about the script, the director, how stories of redemption always mattered most to him. He joked about aging, shared a few memories from the set, even chuckled when Stephen teased him about never taking a break. Stephen said, "Do you ever just take a vacation? Or is working how you relax?" Denzel replied, "No such thing as relaxing when you're a black man in America. You can rest, but you still stay awake." The crowd applauded. Stephen gave a knowing smile and changed topics. For a while, it stayed easy. Then Stephen shifted in his seat, picking up a card he hadn't touched yet. He looked at Denzel, his tone still polite but shifting slightly. That telltale tone of late-night journalism, when a host wants to land a deeper punch without appearing to throw one. He said, "You've spoken a lot about faith, about God guiding your life, even on movie sets. That's rare in Hollywood. And admirable, I think. But don't you ever worry that putting faith ahead of politics might sound like dodging accountability?" Denzel tilted his head, not confused, just deciding how deeply to engage. He said, "Accountability to who, Stephen? You? Twitter? Faith doesn't dodge anything. It grounds me." Stephen nodded slowly, then leaned forward. He said, "But don't you think, and I'm asking with respect, don't you think staying out of politics at a time like this is a form of silence? And isn't silence complicity?" The room got quieter. Denzel didn't speak for a long moment. His expression didn't change, but the air around him did. He said, "Silence is when you say nothing because you're afraid. I say what I believe, but I don't shout it where people are shouting for sport." Stephen said, "But you've got this platform, Denzel. This power. Don't people look to you to speak truth? Especially now," Denzel replied. "I speak it. I just don't yell it. Truth whispered lasts longer than truth screamed." Stephen smiled thinly. He said, "Even if the whisper lets injustice stand." That was the line that shifted everything. Denzel didn't answer right away. He sat back, eyes narrowing slightly. He said, "Stephen, do you know what injustice looks like? Really looks like? Or do you just interview it?" Stephen hesitated. I try to understand. I ask questions." Denzel leaned in. He said, "You sit in a climate-controlled studio, in a suit, with a team of writers handing you moral outrage in punchline form. You call that truth? I've seen truth. I've watched it bleed. I've watched it scream. I've buried friends and stood in courtrooms with mothers who never got justice. Don't ask me about complicity," Stephen said. "I wasn't accusing you, I was." "You were implying," Denzel cut in, "which is more dangerous." The audience wasn't laughing anymore. There were no applause lines. Just silence. Stephen shuffled his cards. He said, "I just think people expect more from voices like yours." Denzel said, "And what do they expect from yours?" Stephen blinked. Denzel stood up, not suddenly, but with the weight of someone who'd made a decision. He said, "I agreed to come here to talk about my work, my faith, my craft, not to be cross-examined by someone who plays moral referee with cue cards." Stephen said, "Wait, are you leaving?" Denzel didn't answer. He walked to the edge of the stage and turned back. He said, "You wanted a soundbite. I offered you soul. You wanted a headline. I offered you history, and you weren't ready for either." The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay still. Denzel looked at Stephen one last time. He said, "The problem isn't that I'm not political. The problem is that your politics need someone like me to validate them. And I won't do that." He walked off stage. Stephen tried to recover, turning to the camera with a forced smile. He said, "Well, Denzel Washington, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back." But the moment had landed, and it wasn't over. The Late Show cut to commercial, but the studio didn't return to normal. Crew members whispered across the floor, unsure whether to clear Denzel's seat or leave it empty. Producers huddled near the side curtain, staring at each other without speaking. Stephen Colbert sat frozen at his desk, thumbing through his note cards like they might contain a script for what to do next. They didn't. The audience buzzed softly, caught between confusion and discomfort. No one had expected a walkout. Certainly not from Denzel Washington. He was supposed to be the night's marquee guest, wise, composed, unshakable. But instead, he had left a silence so profound it drowned out everything that came next. Stephen tried to move on. He returned from break with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced the musical guest. He made a joke about interviews going off script. But the energy never returned. Not on stage, and not in the audience. Later that night, social media erupted. Clips of the confrontation spread fast, especially the moment when Denzel said, "You wanted a headline. I offered you history." It was replayed, quoted, and dissected by thousands within minutes. The internet didn't agree on much, but everyone agreed something extraordinary had happened. The next morning, Stephen addressed it briefly. He said, "Look, sometimes real conversations happen, and sometimes they go places you didn't expect. I respect Denzel Washington. Always have. Still do. But the damage, or transformation, depending on perspective, had already begun." By midday, Denzel released a statement. Just one paragraph. "I walked off that stage not in anger, but in sorrow. I was invited to share what I believe. Instead, I was asked to prove my morality through volume. I've never believed shouting is proof of truth. I believe in living it. I hope that's still allowed." The response was immediate and divided. Some called him arrogant. Others called him brave. Some said he was dodging the hard issues. Others said he'd just delivered one of the most powerful public refusals of performance activism they'd ever seen. And still, the original question lingered in every recap, every comment thread. Was silence complicity? And if it was, then what was moral posturing disguised as questioning? Over the next few days, something surprising happened. Clips began surfacing from other interviews, past appearances Denzel had done, where he had spoken about systemic injustice, about faith and race and power. Quietly, with clarity, not for applause, but for understanding. One clip from a 2018 interview showed Denzel saying, "My job isn't to tell people what to think. My job is to make them feel something deep enough that they want to think for themselves." That quote trended again. Meanwhile, more voices weighed in. An op-ed in The Atlantic said, Denzel didn't storm off. He simply left a space that no longer valued the way he speaks. A podcast host on the left criticized him harshly. This is the problem with wise elder energy. You get praised for restraint when what's needed is confrontation. But others disagreed. An essay in The New Yorker titled "The Quiet That Dares to Speak" argued, what Denzel did wasn't retreat. It was defiance. Against a culture that demands outrage on cue. He refused to be anyone's symbol. For a week, the conversation spread wider than anyone had expected. Not just about the walkout, but about what the walkout represented. On a Sunday morning news panel, a young activist said, Denzel didn't get kicked out. He kicked out the idea that truth needs to be screamed to count. Back at CBS, Stephen's team considered whether to invite Denzel back for a follow-up. Some producers argued it would be healing. Others feared it would look like surrender. They never extended the invitation. But in private circles, inside the industry, people were talking. Because something had shifted. Not because a celebrity made a scene, but because a man refused to become one. And that refusal, calm, deliberate, unwavering, had done what no viral outrage ever could. It had made the noise go quiet, long enough for people to hear themselves and ask what kind of truth they really believed in. The next time Denzel appeared in public, it was not on television. It was at a community center in South Central Los Angeles. No cameras, no press, just him, standing in a circle of young men, talking softly, listening harder, being the thing no late-night segment could ever contain. Present, not for performance, but for something deeper, something that didn't require applause to mean something, something that had been missing until someone walked out and refused to play along. 2 weeks after the Late Show confrontation, the headlines had faded, but the consequences had not. Denzel Washington had not returned to any late-night couches, nor had he responded to new requests for comment. He hadn't tweeted. He hadn't posted on Instagram. He hadn't explained, clarified, or defended. He didn't need to, because the silence that followed him off that stage had become its own kind of voice. At first, pundits tried to reframe the story. They said Denzel had overreacted, that Stephen Colbert had simply asked a question, that the moment wasn't about censorship or confrontation but a misunderstanding. They called it a collision of generational expectations, a missed opportunity for dialogue, even a teachable moment. But none of that could erase what viewers had seen. It wasn't just that Denzel walked away. It was the way he did it. No outburst. No insult. Just a refusal. A refusal to let someone else decide how he should represent his beliefs. A refusal to perform outrage for applause. A refusal to let his platform be repurposed for someone else's narrative. In the weeks that followed, others began to speak up, not publicly, but in the corners of green rooms and behind the scenes at networks. Actors, writers, journalists, people who'd been in that seat before, who knew what it meant when a question came laced with accusation, who'd felt the quiet coercion of being expected to say the right thing, the loud thing, the aligned thing. And some of them, especially black men and women, said the same thing privately. He did what I wish I had done. Not because they agreed with everything Denzel believed, but because he had reminded them that disagreement didn't have to be weakness. That dignity didn't need to shout to be heard. That strength could look like stillness. Stephen Colbert didn't bring up the incident again. Not directly. But a month later, during a panel interview with another guest, he made a passing joke about people walking off if they don't like the questions. The audience laughed politely, but the moment felt forced, because everyone remembered, and the memory didn't laugh. Meanwhile, Denzel kept doing what he always had, showing up where the cameras weren't. Speaking in prisons, supporting literacy programs, funding scholarships, mentoring young actors quietly, one at a time. And eventually, something shifted in how people talked about the Late Show moment. It stopped being about Denzel. It started being about what we expect from people who disagree with us. Do we want conversation or performance? Do we want truth? Or do we want truth packaged in applause-ready lines? Because Denzel hadn't shut down a conversation, he'd exposed what kind of conversation we'd grown used to. One where disagreement gets labeled as betrayal, where not saying enough is treated as saying the wrong thing, where even legends are expected to follow the script. But he hadn't. And in that break, in that calm refusal to keep playing the part, he reminded people of something they didn't know they'd forgotten. That not every question deserves an answer. That not every silence is surrender. That not every moment must be made for TV. Sometimes, real strength is walking away when staying would be easier. Sometimes, revolution sounds like nothing at all. And when Denzel looked into that camera, just before leaving the stage, and said, "The problem isn't that I'm not political. The problem is that your politics need someone like me to validate them." That wasn't a mic drop. It was a mirror. And in the reflection, many people saw something they weren't ready for. Not just a man refusing to be used, but a man reminding the world that being black, being principled, being powerful, doesn't mean being available for whatever message someone else needs you to deliver. He didn't kick out Stephen Colbert. He kicked out the assumptions, the game, the performance. And when he left that chair empty, it said more than any speech could have. Because real truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand up and walk away.